Soy Cuba, or I Am Cuba, is a Soviet film directed by Mikhail Kalatozov. A few months ago, I reviewed the somewhat astounding film The Red Tent. That's the same director. This movie's a lot better known than that, and you'll see why. It's even more somewhat astounding, I guess. You've maybe heard of this one. You've maybe even seen one of the famous tracking shots from the film. This is a really cool movie. In some ways, it might seem like a somewhat straightforward movie. I don't know how long this video will be, but there's some interesting things to it, I think, without a doubt, just besides how different and cool it is. Some would call this movie a propaganda film. This is a Soviet film telling the story of Cuba and of Cuba's relationship with the West and Cuba's relationship with capitalism. This movie came out in 1964, really not so long after Castro took control of Cuba. This movie was actually made during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in part. So clearly this is going to give us a heroic story of the rise of communism, and that's not something that American audiences are too used to seeing, I guess. Even today, there aren't very many movies about that. In some places, I think this movie is fairly nuanced, but in other places, it isn't. There's some American characters in the film that might really stick out to American audiences. Maybe that's part of the reason why some people are very confident that this is propaganda. That's the genre. Of course, on the other side of things, you can find people who will say that if this movie is propaganda, then so is every Hollywood film. But, we just don't notice that because it's the propaganda that we embrace. Controversial. Not really. But I'm just going to leave this label, the propaganda thing, behind and talk about some places, like I said, where it's more nuanced and some places where it's less nuanced. You can decide if this is better or worse than Hollywood on your own time. It's certainly different. Without a doubt, this movie is extreme in certain ways that you might not have really seen before, and not just politically, but also stylistically. In some ways, this movie is the paragon of serious Soviet style. It's clear watching it that this is a movie that's a pinnacle of a genre. But what genre, you might wonder? It's a combination of a lot of influences that we don't see together very often. It's an expressionistic film with tons of Dutch angles and extreme contrast, but it's also got unflinching social realism. It's a political movie. Of course, it's got some of the Soviet montage feel as well, but it also borrows from Hollywood and classic style in a lot of places. It takes all these elements and it really turns them all up to 11. Like I said, it feels like it's at the pinnacle of a genre. It's kind of like if somebody took the Battle of Algiers and spliced it together with M and threw in a pinch of a Cinerama travel film. It's quite a combination. I'll go into some more specifics. But for now, let me just say this is a movie in 4 parts. Sometimes movies in parts can really lose momentum, but this one I think works well. The first parts don't have so much of an overt political message. They're political, but it's not until the second half of the film that we hear anything about the revolution, really. The first part is about tourism and exploitation of Cubans, mainly by Americans. It's set in Cuba before the revolution and centers on a woman who is an escort and how her own romantic life, her own identity, is undermined by this job, by the economy, by the global context, by colonialism, I guess you might say. And I think this part is great. I mean, it gives us a surprisingly incisive picture of a certain type of labor that this woman and her colleagues have to perform, a strangely international labor. The cinematography of the film hits you from the very start. Technically, the beginning of this movie is a narrative introduction. It's 4 parts, but it's got a little intro and it's got little bridges between them. And this narrative part, in the beginning, it shows us rural Cuba. It starts with a really impressive aerial shot. And then we've got some cool shots sort of at water level on a river, and featuring the so-called voice of Cuba narrator, who explains the pre-colonial virtues of her country. Immediately, I think today's audience might be intrigued by how strongly this film comes out against colonialism from the word go. Not something that many American films from 1964 would do, even new films. If there'd be any message like this in a more sort of classic American film, it would have to be sort of heavily shrouded or heavily coded, just implied, or it would have to be sort of somehow forced to align with sort of more mainstream progressive ideals, right? There are some movies about some, not many, there are some films about Native Americans that from the 60s or from this time frame that would portray them in a more generous light, but probably only because it aligns with like a more sort of general, like, oh, treat others how you want to be treated, like American sensibility or something like that. Not because, not to acknowledge like the underlying genocide or something like that. Anyway, point is, you might be surprised from the beginning just how direct this movie is. I guess it shouldn't really be a surprise. Like I said, the Soviet-Cuban production, thoroughly anti-colonial. We jump from this natural rural river scene abruptly to a rooftop party in Havana. This film has a few really harsh cuts in it, and this is another early sign that this is going to be a movie with interesting style, a deliberate style. This is not a way that you would cut a classic movie unless you made some mistake, right? So it hits you in the face from early on that this is going to be a stylish movie, certainly. And this party, it keeps it going. This features a famous and really cool tracking shot where the camera descends several stories and eventually ends up in a swimming pool. Yeah. The camera, it's a little bit shaky, to be fair. These days, sure, there have been better tracking shots since, but, this was in 1964. I remember in the 2010s, when handheld gimbals and drones started to become sort of widely accessible, there were suddenly tons of short films, even Hollywood films, with all kinds of interesting new tracking shots. Oh, up, in through the window, all this stuff. Of course, there are old movies that have done this too, but it sort of became really common. This movie did it 50 years earlier than that. It's probably worth watching Soy Cuba just for the cinematography, just for the shots. It's really cool. I can't say that enough. But there's a lot of other interesting things in here too. So we go from the rooftop. We go inside a club where it turns out this woman is working, and here we've got extreme cinematography as well. This woman, she has a dizzying job in a disorienting industry, right? And this is where we meet the Americans. There are three of them, and two of them are really one-dimensional. All three are antagonists, and the dramatic mechanics of the scene, coupled with the extreme cinematography, really hammer home that these are not good guys. In fact, it's honestly kind of surprising just how potent this club scene is, how much you feel for this woman who's just being tossed around, spun around from guest to guest. Now, frankly, I don't really care, I guess, that the characters here, the bad guys, are Americans. Doesn't matter. In fact, seems very plausible. But I do think that the acting from two of them is pretty bad. And the third one is a bit better, but not great. One way or another, these characters are going to stick out. Which, yeah, like I said, this is maybe one thing that some people might react to. Yeah, acting could be better. Anyway, as the story moves on, we're going to see historical Havana, and we're also going to see the slums. This movie stars mostly, if not entirely, Cuban actors. I don't know who the Americans are. I should have looked into that. Again, this is not something you would really see much from a Hollywood film in the same era, or even from today, honestly. This is a bit of a neo-realist tradition to some degree, using local non-professionals or something like that. That's something we've come a long way from in 2023, not something you see much more, but something that in European cinema actually wasn't that uncommon, even in the 60s. The legacy of neo-realism, which is sort of thought of as a pre-war genre, still going strong at this point. This, I guess, the actors just being there, honestly, gives a certain authenticity and spirit, I guess, to the film that is pretty eye-opening. At the same time, I think there's also a certain amount of detachment to this movie due to the Soviet nature of the film. There's a lot of Cubans in it, but this movie was made by the Soviets. There's a lot of poverty in the film, for instance. We toured the slums, like I said. Now, granted, this scene is before the revolution, but there's still a way in which Cuba, I think, is framed almost as a charity case, as an ally to the Soviet cause, but as people to pity or something like that to some degree. It's a bit subtle, but there's definitely some hints that this movie wasn't made entirely by Cubans. Now, originally, this movie was actually dubbed into Russian, which would have been a pretty big hint, but thankfully, these days, there's a nice 4K remaster with the original audio. I think this film wasn't widely known in the US until the 1990s, although I have the impression that in certain circles, it was well known much earlier, and I think it has had a bit of an influence on American cinema, even from before the 90s. Unfortunately, the Wikipedia page about this movie is really bad, lacking quality sources, mainly. I might try and fix it up. at some point. But yeah, it's a little hard for me to understand the chronology. Anyway, one thing that the page actually mentions, this Wikipedia page, is that the movie wasn't well received in Cuba, apparently because it had too many stereotypes in it. There's really no reputable source for this claim, and understanding how sort of the average viewer reacted to this movie in Cuba 60 years ago is very difficult. So who really knows? But I will say there is a Soviet tinge to this film, definitely. And this slight detachment, I think, is probably a double-edged sword, actually. Maybe we see more of the poverty in this film. Maybe it's starker in some ways than you would if it were made by the Cuban government, even though it's sort of decrying the pre-revolutionary conditions. Maybe it's starker than it would have been. It's possible, on the other hand, that it does lean on some stereotypes. I'm sure it does in some ways. Honestly, when I read that, my mind did not immediately picture any, particular moment in the film. In the second segment, we get a rural farmer. In some ways, sure, simplistic character, but this section to me feels more like a legend than anything else, sort of a folk tale or something. In the third part, we've got some university students. They're a bit naive. And then we've got more rural farmers later. I guess somewhat stereotypical, maybe, but yeah, none of these characters jumped out at me, but hey, I'm not from Cuba, so I don't know. In general, I was impressed by Kalatozov's ability to show up and come up with a movie with such spirit and some real incision, and a movie that is so ambitious. It's ambitious just to go to Cuba to make a movie, believe me. Just to go from, the USSR, fly, I guess, to Cuba and film a movie, partly during the Cuban Missile Crisis is already a pretty wacky endeavor. But to be so ambitious about what the movie is showing, not just in the style, but also in the content, it's pretty darn cool. Like I said, it's a cool movie. One thing that I skipped is that between each segment, we return to this narrator, the voice of Cuba, and she gives us some context about what has just happened or what's about to. I think that this is kind of unnecessary at best, and at worst, it kind of washes away some of the more subtle moments of each segment. Now, the narration is actually, I think, pretty well written, especially closer to the beginning of the film. And I think in the beginning, it's not bad. It's all right. But this is maybe one of the places where it starts to feel less nuanced, and particularly at the end of the first story, you're sort of left, your head's left spinning a bit. It's kind of an extreme story. It's not exactly concluded. Your head is left spinning a bit. There's a lot to think about sort of, this colonial tourism stuff, the big modern city here, the romantic lives, how people's personal lives can be so sort of hijacked by international, economies and politics and all these things. There's a lot to take in. And then this voice of Cuba kind of hops in and spells it all out and says, we're not your tourist vacation. Don't just come here to see the good or something. Which, again, it's not badly written, but like I said, it washes away a little bit of the subtlety, I thought. As the movie goes on, you also realize that they're going to say Soy Cuba a lot in this movie. Gets a little bit old, in my opinion. Definitely don't watch this if you're allergic to soy. Now, I'm jumping around here a little bit, but I think my favorite sections are the first and third ones. The second one is definitely cool, though. In some ways, it has the most extreme cinematography. It shows us a rural family running a farm. They spend most of their time whacking through cane, I think, which is filmed in some very interesting ways. Like I said, this part feels a little bit like a legend or a myth or something like that. I guess I didn't mention it yet, but this movie is filmed in black and white. In 1964, they probably could have made this movie in color, although the logistics of doing that on location might have been a lot, and some of these tracking shots may have really benefited from having, smaller, lighter cameras, I guess. But there's also a clear stylistic preference for the black and white, and the second segment really brings it out. This part, I think, really brings the expressionism, although in a similar way, it almost reminds me of like some of these like kabuki-inspired Japanese films, like Ballad of Narayama or whatever, the original one, or Kwaidan, another movie in 4 parts, actually. Weird comparison, but yeah, stark, high contrast. Those movies rely on color a lot, and this doesn't, but high contrast, tons of Dutch angles. Expressionism, there's also, it's interesting to see, you pick up some sort of noir things in this movie, and it's hard to know sometimes if that's just sort of an earlier inspiration to both genres of just sort of expressionism in general. I don't think it entirely is. I think there is some classic American cinema here too. But anyway, in this section, we've also got, a very gaunt farmer. That's perfectly at home with expressionism. Sadly, Peter Lorre was not available for the role. In this section, we get our first glimpse of the story of the revolution, I guess, when we hear about how it's a bank or how it's the United Fruit Company. Yeah, the United Fruit Company is in this movie. Pretty interesting. Who are the bad guys. It's interesting. One thing to compare is that if you look in 60s American films that have sort of Soviet things in them, it was much more common to have these things to sort of feature the Soviets by proxy. At least if you're watching like television from the 60s, you're watching an episode to Get Smart, the bad guys are always going to be Soviets, right? This is how television works. Just go to whatever country that the U.S. is at war with or, feeling bad about at any given time, and the television shows will have, vaguely stereotypical characters that come from, fictional areas, but that are heavily implied to be this place. Now, actually, I guess it's back in fashion for us to have the Russian bad guys in television. But not that I have anything against that at the moment, I guess. Although it's unclear if television is the best place to fight that sort of battle. Anyway, like I said, if you were to watch an American media from this time that looks at Soviets or something like that, we'd probably see something really vague. And sure, the portrayal of Americans in this movie is a bit hackneyed, one-dimensional. But on the other hand, the United Fruit Company is in the movie. I mean, that's about as specific as you can get, calling out a particular American company. And I mean, as well they should, probably. That's kind of interesting. And, it turns out you didn't have to wait for Howard Zinn to write A People's History of the United States to get some of these storylines. You could have watched them in 1964 if you lived in the Soviet Union. Interesting. Not to say that this is a totally even-handed historical thing, nor that A People's History is either, but anyway, this second part is cool. Interestingly, it doesn't really resolve. The storyline doesn't really resolve, and actually none of the parts resolve exactly, and that's a little bit annoying, but I think it makes the stories feel like they are open wounds, which is probably one of the ideas. I do wish the last section were a bit longer, though. Anyway, I don't want to walk through all the details of the next sections. You should just watch the movie. But like I said, the third is one of my favorites. It shows how even as people are maybe broadly aligned on a mission, it's not always easy to get the ship headed in the right direction. This is a story about students, basically students at the university, I guess in Havana, and some of the organizing they're doing. And it turns out their organizing isn't maybe as organized as it could be, but we get more and more spirit. Some of this will be a story that you've heard before, but this section is pretty compelling, really. There is one place where this section swerves very noticeably into melodrama. If you've seen the movie, you probably know what I'm referring to. A bit unfortunate, doesn't really even make sense. But otherwise, this section is great. It also features a second tracking shot that's one of the most famous of all time, maybe, and just insane. Like, just amazing. And I mean, even by today's standards, you would wonder, how did they do this? Like, even today, I don't know. Amazing. Fidel Castro does not appear in this movie, but all the back and forth, all the disorganization, I guess, among the students really underscores how important a galvanizing leader is, I guess. It's also interesting to see that while these students are working in the cities, working in schools, a relatively privileged position, the Revolutionary Army is coming in from the mountains, right? Is coming in from the jungle. The film goes to great lengths to underscore the blue-collar nature of the revolution. Here and there, we catch a glimpse of the books that the students are reading. Russian books. Turns out, you might be able to guess which ones. But the movie really centers not on the theoretical ideas behind the revolution and the uprising, but on the day-to-day questions of fairness facing extremely normal blue-collar people. And that's interesting. I mean, in some ways, it shouldn't be surprising at all. But today, if you hear people talk about communism today, I think they're much more likely to lean on theory. And that's interesting. I mean, and, in some ways, I think that communism is thought of as an intellectual thing, as some sort of intellectual elitism might be aligned with it. But this is a movie that gets back to the collective roots of it, I guess. Interesting. As the movie goes on, the spirit of solidarity comes into it more and more. Although we never see Fidel, there's a great scene towards the end of the movie where a group of soldiers are captured, revolutionary soldiers, I guess, and their captors threaten them and ask them, "Where is Fidel?" There's silence, and then one of the captives says, "I am Fidel." And they look at him for a second, and the next captive says, "I am Fidel." And the next one says, "I am Fidel." And down the line, they all say, that they're him, the spirit of solidarity. One thing that's pretty interesting about this movie is how it chooses to present recent history. Like I said, this was really filmed not that long after the revolution. When I was watching the first section and seeing this huge party on a hotel rooftop, part of me was thinking, I guess they recreated all of this, It's kind of interesting to see the socialist workman-like recreation of the bourgeois decadence of pre-revolutionary times. I mean, did it grind their gears to be staging all of this? Was it with pride? What would that have been like? It's an interesting moment, this kind of recreation of the recent past before this thing. I don't know. A way that cinema can be so political, you know what I mean? Which I guess no surprise. But yeah, it's an interesting moment. Of course, they didn't build, the city for this movie. You see the skyline. You see this big hotel. They didn't build that hotel. There's a pool on the roof. Is a hotel with a pool on the roof really in the collectivist spirit? I don't know, but it was still there. The hotels, the clubs, these were all still around to make this movie. And the slums also, I guess, were still around. The dust was still settling from the revolution, and here we are making a movie about it. I guess it's no surprise that the movie has such a spirit and such an immediacy. On the other hand, maybe it's lacking in ideological detachment. I don't know. It's interesting, though. I don't know if I have much more to say than that I would have liked to be a fly on the wall when some of these negotiations for the locations were happening. Right now, as in 2023, we're seeing a lot of movies, actually, about recent history. Elizabeth Holmes hadn't even been convicted when development started on her biopic, or possibly biopic. Probably won't be too long before we have a movie about FTX. We'll see if we get a nice collapse of Twitter movie, perhaps. These movies are, and hypothetical movies, they're totally dedicated to the story of a pivotal individual. The WeWork one, there's another one. Pivotal individual, and one who is sort of at sea in capitalism, right? These are all movies about individuals doing capitalism wrong, basically. That's completely the opposite of this movie, where really, well, for one, we don't have any capitalism, and man, it is conspicuous how absent it is, how few things there are to buy in this movie. Man, how few sort of statements there are about some corporate mainstream good life that you would see in basically every single Hollywood movie from around this time. I mean, 1964 is getting a little bit into the modern cinema, but if you look at classic Hollywood cinema, the amount of product placement and just sort of the capital interest of cinema is one of the defining characteristics of everything. It truly is. I mean, if you aren't really, I didn't really realize at first just how much sort of product placement, how important this stuff was in classic cinema until I started reading some articles about the garments, particularly the fashion that was in these movies. And I didn't realize, for instance, that there were stores that were dedicated just to selling like outfits worn in movies. And they had different tiers of these stores. They had fancy ones where you could see the outfit that Joan Crawford just wore in the movie that just came out. Or there were sort of cheaper stores where you could see the one from, last season or something like that. Like, man, the gowns by so-and-so thing. So many elements of these movies. Anyway, just so tied into capitalism. Of course, that's not anywhere in this movie at all. And in some ways, it's a breath of fresh air. But more fundamentally, in some ways, this movie doesn't even have something as basic as individuals, which is a cornerstone of American life and certainly of American cinema. No individuals here. Weird. How unusual, how un-American. But like I said, Fidel Castro never appears in the movie. Instead, we get a bunch of people all saying that they are Fidel to confuse the police, but also to embody the spirit. But not only is Fidel not in the movie, but nobody. Like I said, no real individuals here. Each of the stories is short enough that they're not resolved. We don't really learn what happens to any of the characters, right? The farmer at the end is subsided into an army, right? The students, some of them blur into the crowd, others fall and are replaced, right? No individuals. So anyway, that's getting a little bit into some of the ideas here. I do think there's more to think about with this movie, and I wish that there was a little bit more information about it, or that I knew a little bit more information about the production of all these things. Because I do think it's pretty fascinating to understand what it would have been like to make this movie, and I do wish that I could see more vividly some of the Soviet traces on the film and try to understand them. But as it is, I mean, like I said, this is first and foremost just a really cool movie, an extremely ambitious movie. It's a movie from a parallel reality, really, that feels like it's way, way ahead of its time. Like I said, tracking shots that would be impressive today, but also a movie in its sort of strangeness that feels like it's maybe the last of something. So that's Soy Cuba, a really special movie that I strongly recommend you check out.